Hello and welcome to the Discover History YouTube channel, and tonight I want to show you several books about archery, and in particular historical archery. I don't know about you, but I'm sure there's lots of people watching this that has actually shot a bow at some point in their life. Most of the bows that you can get today are actually very lightweight bows, to be fair, and most of them are made of all sorts of materials, including fiberglass, for example. However, I'm talking about bows that are traditional, what is often referred to as traditional or historical bows. And amazingly, I actually have quite a collection of bows, going really from prehistoric bows, which were very rare, I must say, going all the way through up to the Victorian and Edwardian sporting bow, basically. And it's quite interesting because bows were used after that period as well, and famously they were sometimes used by agents or even soldiers during the Second World War, not regular, not commonplace, for silencing sentries, because obviously a bow is pretty silent. It's funny though, because whenever we work in schools and we get children to act out archers, for example, they always seem to make a noise when they are supposedly shooting a bow. And obviously you've only got to watch some films, you can hear the arrows going through the air. And the interesting thing is, you don't really get much noise from archery. It's a silent killer as such, really. Now, we will be showing you during lockdown number 3 some of the bows that I own. So for example, I will show you my prehistoric bow, and I'll talk about archery in prehistory, and then I'll also look at things like the famous longbow that was very common in the Middle Ages and in the Tudor period, and I'll talk about that, and I'll bring in a selection of arrows for you to see. So in a way, this can act as sort of an introductory video of some of the videos that we will be doing over lockdown. So I will be taking a look at some of my bows. If you look through the playlist and you look into military history, I think we've already done 2 videos on weapons, specifically weapons. We took a look at, for example, the SMLE, the Lee Enfield, that was used during the First World War and including into the Second World War, and famously also used in Afghanistan by some of the Taliban. And Ian also did a very good video on the Brown Bess musket. So if you haven't seen those, have a look at those. So this is really turning the clock earlier than that, when we don't have gunpowder, we don't have metal, we're talking about wooden bows, traditional bows, as I said, archery. So I've got a selection of books that will introduce this topic, and these are books that I would recommend. The first one is quite a basic book, but it is quite an interesting one that I acquired some years ago now, and it's called Archery for the Reenactor. And the good thing about this is it gives you a nice introduction to the topic. Now, this was wrote by someone called Jonathan Davis, and it covers the period from 1066 to 1595. So it really starts with the early type of bows, the short bows, the long bows specifically, and then obviously it goes up to the period of the Tudors, where I said the longbow was still quite a common feature of the battlefield, really. And I find the Tudor period an interesting one because you have gunpowder weapons, so you get calivers, you get arquebuses, muskets, also being used alongside bows and crossbows. It's quite an interesting period. So this book is a nice overview, and it's full of details, practical advice for shooting a bow today. And you will notice I'm using the word shoot because famously you can't fire a bow. You can fire a gun, hence why you often hear the term firearm, and that really involves the explosion, the gunpowder, the fire. Whereas it talks about practical advice for shooting the bow, and obviously it's really good. It's handy for learning the basics of archery, including knowing where the bow has come from and where it's going. There are some illustrations in it, including descriptions of the parts of the bow, and also, more importantly, parts of arrows, because people often associate bows and arrows being a very simple item, really, and they often think an arrow is an arrow. Well, obviously we break arrows down into different parts. For example, we have the cock feather, we've got the shaft, and we've also got things like the nook. And then also in here you have a very brief overview of medieval arrowheads. And I say a brief overview purely because we now know there is a huge array of arrows that were around in the Middle Ages, and this is only a small selection of them. And archaeologists now often give them a type, so you get a type 32 and so on, and there are literally hundreds and hundreds of different types, but it's a nice little book to act as a starter book, really. If you are interested in constructing your own bow, there's quite a few books out there, including this one, which is Making the Bow Stave Longbow. This is Don Adams' book, and this was a book that I purchased just to give me an idea of how bows are made, because I always think if you're going to talk about bows, if you're going to talk about bricks, if you're going to talk about Roman buildings or anything really, I think it's quite important to know how things are constructed, not just to talk about the finished product, but also to talk how the processes go into manufacturing things. And this one, once again, covers the whole lot. So if you do fancy making a bow, it's quite an interesting book. It talks about how you go about it. There's some lovely little illustrations in it showing you the parts of bows, how each individual piece is made. And there's some fantastic photographs in here, black and white, because it's quite an old book really, but showing you how a longbow specifically is made out of a chunk of wood, usually taken from the main trunk of the tree. And it's quite funny because we all know when we were children, I know I was, we would get a branch really, a curved branch, and use that as a bow, whereas the best bows are actually made from the trunk of the tree, the chunkiest bit of wood that you can find really, and that enables you to manipulate it and alter it however you want. So it's another good book, but this is specifically on the longbow, which is famously the bow of the medieval and Tudor period. A very interesting book, I always think, because this combines military history and also archaeology together, is this book. It's quite an old book now. It came out many years ago by Alf Webb, and it's called Archaeology of Archery. And basically, it's a good description because it explains what's inside the book. It covers the evidence that we have for bows in use in history. So it starts with some of the prehistoric bows, and this also includes bows from America, from the Native Americans, and it shows you how the very early bows were often of this variety, which is the flat bow. And one of the bows that I own, the oldest bow that I've got, is a south bow or a flat bow, and it was used in prehistory. It's basically when humans suddenly realised that if you're going to stab an animal or another person, you do have to get pretty close, especially if you're using a spear, or if you've got, for example, a sword by the time you get to the Middle Ages. Whereas if you use a throwing spear, a javelin, or if you use an arrow in a bow, it enables you to hit targets further away, and therefore your life expectancy is much better. To kill an enemy, to kill an animal at a distance is much safer. So as you can see, the prehistoric period is where we first get our earliest bows. The ancient Egyptians, by the way, are the first ones to use bows en masse in battle as such really, because you have to remember in prehistory they were mainly used for hunting, but could have also been used in battles as well. And this book takes you all the way through, including some fantastic illustrations of some archaeological finds, including bows, by the way. And there's also a nice selection in here all about arrows, the science of archery, and famously, as I've already mentioned, everything about the ancillary equipment as well, including wrist guards and in gloves. And interestingly, they weren't always used in history. It is a fantastic book, a really, really good book. There we have a page just on arrowheads, in particular flint ones, which was used at the end of the Stone Age and into the Bronze Age. And then we've got some archaeological illustrations of some iron ones. And you have to remember, they were also made out of bronze. There was also wooden arrows, and also arrows made out of things like antler as well over the years. If you are interested in medieval archery or Tudor archery specifically, then really you need some books on the longbow. And one of my favourite books has to be The Longbow, which was wrote by Robert Hardy. And if you're unsure who Robert Hardy is, I remember him from my childhood as someone that was an actor specifically out of All Creatures Great and Small, but famously he is actually an archery expert. And you see a nice little painting of him actually on the back of this book if you're unsure who Robert Hardy is. And this is a social and military history of the longbow. And Robert Hardy famously studied the bows from the Mary Rose, and I won't go into too much detail, but he was the one that tested a lot of the bows from the Mary Rose and realised that they had an unbelievably large poundage. In other words, to pull back the bow, it would take, in some cases, 100-pound pull to pull it back from literally where the bow pointed or the arrow point is back to the ear, which is absolutely amazing, really. All the bows that I own have quite a low poundage. They're not over 100-pound pull on them. I think the largest one I've got has about a 50-pound, 55-pound pull on it. So pulling back 100-pound, you would need to be learning or training in using the bow from a young age, which famously medieval and Tudor children had to do. So specifically on the longbow, it's a very, very good book. And then finally, or one final one after this, so the penultimate book has to be this one. It's quite a chunky book, and this one was co-wrote by Robert Hardy and Matthew Strickland, and this is From Hastings to the Mary Rose. So once again, the medieval period, medieval and Tudor, the Great War Bow. And it is a fantastic book, well worth getting hold of, and they use a lot of evidence in here from the Mary Rose, from the bows on there. But it's a nice book because it takes you chronological through the use of the bow in battle. And there are even a large amount in here of statistics that has been gathered from testing the bows from the Mary Rose. Once again, like all the other books that I've got, a fantastic book. Some people say, well, you can get a lot of this information on the internet today, so do you really need books? But trust me, if Ian did ever pan around the room we're filming in has a huge collection of shelves that are just groaning under the weight of books. I like to get a book, I like to open a book, especially books that I can use as reference, and that's one of the reasons when I buy a book I don't actually get rid of them. And if you ever came here at the Discover History headquarters, you won't find a fiction book not belonging to me anyway. You will literally find books like this one, really, and this one is specifically on the longbow. But the final book I will show you is the Military Archery at Sea, and this is a book that I bought literally because sometimes we do get asked to do events running along the theme of naval warfare. We've played, for example, Mary Rose Crew before, including Mary Rose Archers. So this sort of book is quite specific, by Hugh David Saw, and it looks specifically at archery at sea. And once again, it makes use of some illustrations of archery or combat on board ships years ago, and it covers the medieval period, and it also moves on to towards the end on the latter part of the Middle Ages into the Tudor. So it's quite a book that's worth getting hold of. So as always, do have a look at our videos. This one will go into the playlist of military history. But remember, the thing about bows is it could technically fit into social history as well, because you have to remember from as far back as the invention of the bow back in the prehistoric period, bows were used not just for war use or for killing an opponent, it was also used for hunting, and that's the same with the medieval and the Tudor. Interesting fact, when you look at the bows that I've got, when we get to post Tudor and we get into the 17th century, because the gun's taken over now, the bows are mainly being used for leisure purposes, and that's the same as why I've got a Victorian and Edwardian longbow, because they were not being used in combat in that period, but they were being used for leisure purposes. You set the targets up in a stately home or a garden and you shoot the bow there. If you ever go to some stately homes, for example, if you go to Brodsworth Hall, which is owned by English Heritage, there is an archery area in the grounds there. And obviously the Victorians and Edwardians did like afternoon leisure, where you would sit outside, have cream teas, for example, and shoot some arrows at a target, for example. So it's interesting that after warfare with bows, it becomes a leisure activity, and in a way that's why we have, even in the Olympic Games today, archery. It's a sport today, it's a leisure activity and sport. Anyway, on that note, stay safe, subscribe, and make sure you look out for future videos, which will also include things like the flat bow, my longbow, Victorian bows, and so on. Let us know what you want to see. It's as much your channel as it is ours. Stay safe, and we'll see you soon. Bye bye.